Let's talk about function. And from the very beginning, we are actually inside a main function, and I am referring it as a function. And whenever we have a function inside a class body, we call that a method. In general, we know that a function actually does a specific task. Whatever code we put into the function body, that will be executed whenever this function will be called or invoked. And we know that this main function is actually called or invoked by the framework itself. We don't generally call this a main function, but we can create any function or one or multiple functions as per our need. And we know that a function does a specific job, and whenever that job is needed, we simply call that function. And function can take parameters if we want to provide some value from outside, and that value will be processed inside the function body. And also, after doing its task, function can return a value or a calculated value, or simply if it doesn't return any value, it can return void. And also in Dart, we don't have to mention the return type void. We can actually remove that type, simply provide the method or function name. So let me create a new function. For example, let me define a very simple function, say void add, and this function takes two parameters and of type integer, like int x and int y. And the purpose of this function is to add this two value and return the sum. So maybe I can write like this: sum equals x plus y, and then I simply no, I'm not returning here, so simply print sum. Okay, or maybe I don't have to make it in two lines. I can remove one line because I don't have to receive the sum of the the result in a separate variable. All I can do is simply execute the expression inside the print function, so I can actually reduce one line. Okay, so now I have created a very basic function that takes two parameters. So this is the parameter list, and we must have to provide two parameters of type integer, and this function will add the two integers and print it. And this function will not be called or be executed unless we call it. So we have to call this function from anywhere else, maybe inside another function or inside the main. So inside the main function, I'm now calling this add function, and by providing this parameter list over here or bracket, I have to pass two parameters. And if I don't pass anything, it is showing an error, an obvious error, and that says that two positional arguments expected by add but zero found. So these are somewhat called the positional arguments. As you can see, it clearly states that two positional arguments. That means the arguments we declared here, or the way we have declared the arguments here, are called positional argument. Why it is positional? Because we have to provide the values for each parameter in order to position. That means if I provide a value, for example 5, that means this 5 will be assigned to x. And if I provide another value, and this value will be assigned to y, so it maintains a position. So I cannot just assign the first parameter to the second argument, or the second parameter value to the first argument. It always will maintain a position, and that's why it is called positional argument. Okay, now if I run this application, you will see the output. And sometimes whenever we have some method like that, that means we have only one line in the function body. So if you have this situation, we can actually remove the function body, and we can actually express this function in one line, and that will be something like that. So let me cut this, and let me remove the body, and let me provide this fat arrow, and then just press or print. So we actually replace the body with this fat arrow, but remember, we can only do this only when we have one line in our function body. So I just wrote previously declared a sum variable, final variable, where I actually put the result, then I printed the sum. So that function had 2 lines of code. So if you have multiple lines in function body, then you cannot do that. You can only do that when you have just 1 line of execution in your function body. Okay, now this function is actually adding the value, and also this function is printing the result. We can actually remove some burden from that function by saying that function that you don't have to print, you just return the sum or the result. So I can just remove the print function, and I am now here returning x plus y, and in this case the return type would be integer, because the sum of 2 integer values will always be an integer, right? And in Dart you have the freedom to remove the return type also, so it is like a shorthand form of a function. Okay, so we don't have to specify the return type in this case, because Dart will determine that. And now if I run this application, we will not be able to see anything, because now this function is only adding the values. Now it didn't take the responsibility to also show the result or output, and we know that this function returns a value now. So what you can do is we can actually put this whole declaration, function declaration or call inside the print method like that. Okay, so now if I run this application, you will see the output as before. Okay, so now let's talk about few more things. We know that this function requires 2 arguments, and we know that these arguments are called positional arguments. We can actually make these arguments optional, and what I mean by that is, whenever right now if I call this function, I must have to provide 2 arguments. But what if I just want to provide 1 argument? For example, I will just provide the value for x, and I don't want to provide any value for y. So what should I do then? I don't know why I should do that for adding 2 numbers, but let's just consider the scenario. I'm just trying to tell you how we can make our function parameter optional. So for example, let's make this y argument, the second argument of add function, optional. To do that, we have 2 options. So we can make arguments of a function, or 1 argument or 2 argument, or all the arguments of a function or the constructor parameters in 2 ways. One is called the positional optional, and the second one is called the named optional. So now I'm currently showing you the positional optional. So if I want to make this y parameter optional, all I have to do is just put this argument inside this bracket, and all of a sudden this will be optional. And to prove that, just remove the second argument from that method call, and you see that we see no error over here. Yes, we are seeing an error inside this declaration over here, but now this no error thing actually showing that we can now provide 1 argument, and that argument will be assigned to integer x, or the first parameter. But this value is showing is all about the y cannot have a value of null because of its type. You see that it is something like we defined a variable or a variable over here, but we didn't assign any value. So to remove this error or to solve this problem, we have 2 options. One is to make this nullable, or we can provide a default value for this argument, and you can do that by simply assigning a default value. So remember, whenever we have an argument that is optional, we should provide a default value for that. And now if I run this application, the output will be simply 5 plus 0 equals 5, because the value we are providing for x, so x will be 5. We are not providing any value for y, so y will be will remain to 0, and the output will be 5. And if we provide the second argument, for example 15, now the default value of y will be overridden, and now 15 will be assigned to y and the output will be 20. So in this way, we can actually turn a required parameter or positional parameter to a positional optional. And if you want to make all the parameters optional, you simply put all the parameters inside this bracket like this one. So this one. And now we have to provide a default value for x as well. And now when we call this add function, we can either pass one argument, we can either pass we can either pass two arguments, and we can either pass nothing. So there will be no error and the output will be 0 in this case. And remember one thing, if you have a combination of something like mandatory argument and optional argument, just like before, because a moment ago x was mandatory and I'm just turning this x into mandatory once again, and now y is mandatory. So if you have a situation like that, then always put the optional variable after the mandatory one. So what I'm trying to do is, don't do something like this. That means x may be optional, so make it optional by wrapping the argument inside a bracket and then provide a value, and then the second argument is mandatory. So Dart will not allow that. So if you have a mandatory argument in your function parameter list, put it at first. So put all the mandatory argument first, and the optional arguments should be should follow the mandatory arguments. Okay, so you have to be very careful about that. So this is one way of making arguments optional, and it is called the positional optional. So we have another type of another options to make arguments optional, and that is the named optional. Let me define another function. For example, let me define a function called calculate area, and let me have two double values for double width or double length, or maybe width and height, dth width and double height. And this function I will simply return width multiplied by height. Okay, and this function will return a double as well. And now if I want to make the arguments optional, and now I want to make them named optional. So this example is all about named and optional. Okay, so to turn these variables or arguments to a named optional, we have to use a bracket, but not this bracket, this third bracket. We have to use the curly brace or the second bracket. And for example, if I want to make all the variables optional, so select the arguments and wrap them inside this bracket, that means the second or curly brace. And now you have to provide the default value here also. So this should be 0.0 and the height's default value should be 0.0. Now we have provided the default value, and now let's call this calculate area function inside a print function. So calculate area, and now if I don't pass anything, it will not show any error because all of the arguments are optional. And now if, for example, I want to provide a value for width, and if I want to do that, or simply I want to provide one argument, for example 150.0, and it will show an error. It says too many positional arguments, 0 expected and 1 found. So in this case, Dart is saying that this function doesn't receive any positional argument. So the way we declare the parameters are not positional. So by wrapping these arguments inside this curly brace, this has become optional, and whenever we try to provide any value for these optional variables, we must have to mention the property name. For example, if I wish to provide this value for the width, I have to mention the variable like this, so width, and then colon, and then pass the variable. So this 150 will be assigned to width variable directly. And if I want to provide the height, just call the height. You have to be very careful. so that this argument, this keys are same. Okay, so now provide another value. Okay, so in this way we are providing the value after the names of the argument. And the great thing about this named optional is we can actually alter the position, and here the position doesn't matter. So now I have provided only one argument, and that is height. So this height will be assigned to this one. So see, there is no point or there is no necessary to provide the arguments according to position. That's why it is called named optional. So it is optional, and when you provide the value, just call the name and provide the value. And I can actually provide the first parameter at the last position, just like this. So this is the beauty of these named optional parameters, and it is very useful because if a function requires a lots of argument, for example 4 or 5, and it is a very tedious job to provide all the arguments, and if it were positional, then you have to be very careful so that you provide the right value to the right argument. But in this way, you know what value you are providing and where it is assigning. So in this way you actually know where you are putting this value. And you will see in Flutter, in most of the widgets, when you actually provide information or in the widget class constructor, most of the widget constructors are named optional, receives named optional parameters, because it's very visible and it's very concise. And one more thing I want to tell you before I finish this video, that is, for example, you want to declare a method and you want the parameters be named optional or simply named, but at the same time you want the argument should be mandatory. What I'm trying to say is, for example, if this calculate area, for this calculate area method, if I provide nothing, there will be no error because these are optional, right? But what I'm trying to say is, what if I want to convert it to named optional to named required? So the idea is, I will provide the value with the named parameter, but at the same time I must have to provide the values for width and height. So I must have to provide width and height. At the same time I will provide them with the name. In this situation, all you have to do is use this required keyword before the variable declaration or argument declaration. So required double width and required double height, and in this case you don't have to provide any default value because this will be mandatory. So now this function showing error, it says the named parameter width required and the height is required, so we must have to provide the width and height this time, and we have to provide it in a conventional way, the way it actually requires. That means the name first, you have to mention the name, maybe height, and then provide a height, and also the width and provide a width. So in this way we are leveraging the power of named parameter. Also we are making each argument required so that we can provide, or the caller may provide all the arguments it needs.